Welcome to the second hearing of the Committee's review of the Electric Vehicles Revenue Arrangements Act 2021. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today, and I pay my respects to Elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. And I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today or watching us at home. My name is Abigail Boyd and I'm Chair of this committee. I ask everyone in the room to please turn their mobile phones to silent. Parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses in relation to the evidence they give today. However, it does not apply to what witnesses outside of the hearing, and I urge witnesses to be careful about making comments to the media or to others after completing their evidence. In addition, the Legislative Council has adopted rules to provide procedural fairness for inquiry participants, and I encourage committee members and witnesses to be mindful of these procedures. So I now welcome our first witness. If I could ask you to please state your name and position title, and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
Daniel Petich, Research and Policy Official at the Transport Workers Union of New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And would you like to commence with a short opening statement?
Yes, please.
Please go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Petich and I am the Research and Policy Official at the Transport Workers Union of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by thanking the committee for the opportunity to speak here today. The Transport Workers Union of New South Wales represents tens of thousands of workers who conduct critical functions in road transport, passenger transport, aviation, oil, waste management, gas and freight logistics. As such, we have a vested interest in matters relating to road users in New South Wales. The application of the road user charge mechanism in the Electric Vehicles Revenue Arrangements Act, which I'll refer to as the Act, is something that is contingent on one of two things: the date of 1st of July 2027, or that the Minister is reasonably satisfied that the sales of battery electric vehicles in New South Wales will be 30% of all new vehicle sales in the state. The charge operates as a distance-based road user charge calculated by applying the relevant rate to the number of kilometres a vehicle travels on public land. So this could very well impose a significant burden on rideshare drivers using battery electric vehicles, and could have a disproportionate financial impact on parcel delivery operators, particularly as electric vehicles become more common in the industry. Such a charge could discourage commercial EV uptake, raising legitimate economic and policy concerns, although the extent of that impact in practice, of course, remains open to debate. Considering the precedent established by Vanderstock versus Victoria, it is likely that the road user charge as is could be considered invalid under the premise that it is viewed as an excise. But with that said, there is legitimate reasoning behind a road user charge, should the justification be centred on funding road infrastructure and other associated projects. So our position isn't that EV drivers should or shouldn't be paying a road user charge, but rather that it should be equitable and that it shouldn't detract from the government's decarbonisation goals. I welcome all questions from the committee, and I'd also like to add that, as raised in our submission in the Act itself, heavy vehicles are excluded from its scope. However, even though this is the case, I'm more than happy to take any questions if the committee would like to comment on heavy vehicles as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I might start with just a few. So I think when we go back sort of 5 years ago to look at when, this road user charge was first proposed, I think there was the view at the time that most of these vehicles were quite expensive, and this was sort of the purview of the richer people. Now that we've sort of come 5 years down the track, we're seeing a lot of cheaper vehicles coming onto the market. In terms of, I guess, particularly I'm thinking about delivery drivers and others who are trying to avoid they do a lot of driving and they're trying to avoid the massive fuel costs. How likely would something like a road user charge be to discourage them from buying an electric vehicle for those purposes as opposed to a petrol vehicle?
I would say unlikely. The upfront cost, as you've just said, has decreased for a lot of vehicles, mostly for passenger vehicles. For fleet, it's still quite expensive, but right now there is a government incentive. There is a New South Wales government EV fleet incentive where, depending on the weight of the vehicle, the government will contribute basically give a grant of a certain amount. For heavy vehicles, for example, it can be up to $50,000, depending on the size of the vehicle. But it's not necessarily just the upfront costs, it's of course the ongoing operational costs. And I think it'd be a similar case to what we've seen with some EV drivers and prospective EV drivers in, say, Western Sydney and outer suburbs, where they are the ones benefiting the most from the cost savings that would be associated with running an EV instead of an ICE vehicle. But if the road user charge is based on distance, then those drivers who are travelling more and more are going to be seeing diminishing returns in terms of how much they're saving. So take rideshare and parcel delivery. I'm using both as an example because rideshare drivers tend to take 5 to 6 times the average kilometres per year as opposed to the general Australian motorist, which travels, I think, on average 12,000 kilometres a year. But for rideshare, in the worst of cases, you see 60,000 plus. It's a similar case with parcel delivery. And once you start seeing those numbers, the costs are going to add up very quickly, which, yeah, to me, that would be a major disincentive for companies and operators and owner drivers too. Yeah.
Something that I probably should have looked up, but I'm curious. Does this, so obviously we have e-bikes, and I know that there was a reference to e-bikes in your submission, and then we have sort of electric motorbikes, of which there are not sort of as many as my understanding kind of on the market. Do you know if this act actually covers those kind of electric motorbike vehicles?
Oh, you'll have to forgive me because there wasn't actually any reference to e-bikes in our submission.
There wasn't?
No, but so I can't claim it's my area of expertise.
Yeah, okay. I thought I saw that in yours. Maybe I didn't. Thank you. Does anyone else want to hop in?
Sure. Thanks very much for your submission and for your attendance here today. Just interested in terms of some of the issues that you raise. Do you believe that there's an inequity at the moment for some of your members who may be using internal combustion engines for exactly the same purposes, who might be paying fuel excise, or most certainly are paying fuel excise?
Well, to say there's an inequity, I think that's a strong way to put it. It's more so that if we're talking about a potential road user charge for the EV side of things, there's been some data that's come out that demonstrates that they might be paying more in comparison to the excise paid at the Bowser by ICE vehicles. A pretty common complaint and cost of living issue we see with, say, Uber drivers that run an ICE vehicle, which are still the majority of vehicles in rideshare, is the fuel costs, but that's also in tandem with other operational costs like vehicle maintenance and toll road costs. And rideshare drivers, of course, don't pay the toll themselves once a passenger is in their vehicle, but at any other point in their journey they do. And oftentimes it's a case of it's not so simple as just don't take the toll road, right? When their economic imperative is to constantly be on the move and get from A to B as quickly as possible, they have to take the toll roads. So it's less in isolation, and it's more so as a compounding effect that the fuel costs are definitely contributing, and there's minimal cost relief for them in that regard. So it's definitely a big pressure. It's just whether or not, in terms of EVs, our position is more so focused on whether that's going to be equitable for the EV side of things, in contrast to actually trying to achieve the figures the government has set out with its decarbonisation goals.
Okay. Now, in terms of, you've of course done some assessment of Vanderstock, noted in your submission. Just in terms of that, what sort of advice are you giving to your members about the reality of this charge actually coming into effect as of 1 July 2027?
Well, to my understanding, we've had some discussions with members in rideshare, though admittedly I don't know the ins and outs of that at the moment, but they are aware that this could become a reality for them. I can't say for certain that there's too much concern about it at the moment, purely because in terms of the actual percentage of EVs in rideshare, there's still a minority. It's a growing interest. The adoption's definitely there, and interest is definitely there. But at the moment, the majority of vehicles are ICE vehicles and hybrids. So really, at this point, it's more so of, are these drivers who are prospective EV operators, are they actually then going to transition once this comes into effect? But that remains to be seen.
And do you have any opinion or consultation with your members with respect to its application on plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that are both, I guess, subject to a fuel excise in terms of their petrol component, but also would be subject to the component of a road user charge when it comes to their battery usage, which is at about 80% of the total usage charge?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Our national office does a lot of work with rideshare drivers, so they may have done some work into it. I can take that on notice if you'd like, but
Okay.
I don't at the moment have any information.
And with respect to delivery drivers as well, what sort of percentage of the fleet, like anecdotally, I think you're quite right in terms of while it might be a minority when it comes to rideshare, it's certainly a growing minority, and I do note and just had a quick check there, but my observations are when you get an Uber now that previously you used to pay a premium for an EV, now they're pretty much the same price, or at this point in time they're exactly the same price in terms of whether you get an electric or not, which sort of shows that there are a lot more on the road. But in terms of that delivery component, what sort of percentage of the fleet are you seeing in terms of EVs at present?
I don't have a figure for percentages, but we do see companies like Australia Post really bringing on thousands of electric vans and hybrid vehicles. So the adoption is definitely there. I don't have a specific figure,
Yep.
but we're seeing a significant increase tangibly and a lot of interest as well. And it's also the case not just for big entities like Australia Post, but individual contractors are starting to kind of raise their eyebrows at these prospects, and which is again why I raised the potential road user charge might harm that interest.
And when it comes to a commercial vehicle like that, what sort of disparity are you seeing in terms, or differential are you seeing in terms of the price upfront of an EV in those categories compared to an ICE vehicle?
Well, up until recent times, they've always been more.
Yeah.
Of course, they've always been more expensive. We're lucky to be in 2026 at the moment. As I raised earlier, there's a new EV incentive, a fleet incentive by the government, to which has been extended to heavy vehicles this year. Light commercial vehicles are included in that as well. So depending on the actual gross vehicle mass of the vehicle in question, the prospective buyer gets a certain amount from the government, which helps. But upfront cost isn't necessarily the be-all, end-all for these operators. It's more so the ongoing basis that they're concerned about. But yes, historically, the electric vans have always been more than the ICE vans.
Yeah. And look, to the chair's point before, I guess that when this first came in, there was seen as a huge differential between an EV and an ICE vehicle. Now with I think you can get an EV for about $33,000 for sort of some of the entry-level ones. I wasn't sure if when it came to the commercial vehicles, there'd been that same sort of decrease in pricing as well, or?
Not necessarily, no.
I suspected that might be the case at that end of the market. I think that's all the questions from me. Thank you.
Chair, thanks Daniel for your appearance today. Just in terms of priorities at the TWU, you mentioned support for decarbonisation goals, but isn't it overwhelmingly in the interests of your membership to make sure there's sufficient funding available for road maintenance and construction, because that's obviously the bread and butter of the TWU on the road. So how do you prioritise that, and what's your best recommendation for ensuring that we don't lose road maintenance and construction revenue because of the EV challenges?
That's a great question. I'd like to segment that in a couple of different ways. So firstly, I think if we're justifying this road user charge, it should be on the basis that it can fund road infrastructure, and I think it would be equitable if we turn around and say, well, the money that's coming in from this charge should go towards general road infrastructure, but also electric vehicle infrastructure. We argue that that's all fine and good. If we were to have this charge, we can use it for those things. And then the question becomes, at what level does this charge become imposed? Because in our submission, we raise that we like the idea, say, having a federal-based charge for consistency, but then that brings in the question of whether or not the funding is going to go, like how does it go back state to state? we've used heavy vehicles as an example. I understand heavy vehicles are really outside of the scope of the Act, but if we take a look at what the heavy vehicle industry is facing at the moment, it's what I've described before as a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Where you've got a lot of interest in the industry in terms of actually adopting these electric vehicles, but the infrastructure is not there, right? And it's not just the infrastructure. You need the charging infrastructure and all that in different parts of the regions, but that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to establish. But then you also need to future-proof the roads in the regions because electric vehicles are heavier. They contribute to more road wear and tear, and this is absolutely the case for electric heavy vehicles, right? They're going to, if a heavy vehicle is accounted for in road wear and tear, an electric truck's going to be a lot worse than that, right? So that's also going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So the funding question is really, can we allocate some of this road user charge, if it's going to come in, to the funding of the infrastructure that's supporting these vehicles? I think that would be equitable.
Right. Do you think it's a legitimate goal that the funds raised that way are the equivalent of fuel excise for the average light vehicle in Australia, that we're aiming to ensure that we can raise money from EVs at about that equivalence?
Well, I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with the road user paying their way, and the same really goes for EVs, but then it becomes a matter of how do we balance it with trying to achieve the decarbonisation goals? Is this going to be such an imposition that it's going to deter commercial buyers, which I would argue commercial buyers should be a priority for the government. There's a large pool of users here who are racking up the most kilometres on their vehicles. They should really be a priority, and I raised in our submission that we mention a potential special category, not necessarily an exemption. Like I say, we do agree that road users should pay their way, but if commercial operators can have some manner of cost relief or consideration in proportion to how much they're driving their vehicle, then that would be a more equitable arrangement, and we can still fund the infrastructure that's necessary through that.
Right, so you support distance-based charging on the EVs, how much they're driving their vehicles. When this was debated in our chamber several years ago, the challenge seemed to relate to the efficiency of government in actually accurately assessing how far an EV has travelled. Can you wind back the odometer, which would be a natural inclination for anyone who can get away with it. And there was a concern raised, I think, across the chamber about privacy if government ever got to the point of putting trackers in those cars to monitor where you've been.
Well, we have trackers and a lot of invasive telematics in heavy vehicles. I guess we can't rule them out for light vehicles either, but we...
Right. How does that work for the heavy vehicles? I wasn't aware of that, and I know your average citizen wouldn't like the idea of government knowing where they're travelling.
No, probably not, but there is a kind of sweeping mechanism in the heavy vehicle industry ranging from different telematics, eye trackers, telematics that can monitor pedal inputs, and of course telematics that accurately monitor...
They're in the hands of the companies, are they?
Yeah,
not
distance travelled in the truck.
Not government, yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm afraid tracking on vehicles with the information available for government will be a conspiracy theorist picnic, because they've dropped off a bit now, but there was a mob banging on about smart cities that in the light poles there's monitoring devices. I've never looked at a light pole the same way since they said that, but I don't think it's entirely true. So yeah, there's a lot of issues here in trying to do this accurately. What's the TWU's stance on government having access to kilometre tracking information?
Maybe it's a degree of overreach.
Yeah, your members wouldn't like it. Your truckies wouldn't be too happy about it. They probably think that company access is inevitable, but government is a bridge too far.
Yeah, I think that would be the general consensus. In fact, a lot of them, depending on which type of telematics we're talking about, a lot of them are of the opinion it's perhaps too much. Though a lot of that comes down to the lack of consultation and transparency they receive with how all that works. But yeah, I think there'd be a bit of government overreach in that regard.
Just on a related issue, what's the percentage of EVs for heavy vehicles, the vehicles that your truckies drive in Australia, in New South Wales?
I don't have an exact
You
percentage.
don't, but it's pretty low, isn't it? 1 or 2%.
It is very low. It is
Maybe?
very low.
And-
Interest is there, and we've seen a lot of trials. Again, government incentives are trying to prop that up, but we lack the infrastructure and the road capacity really to make this a big thing across the board, because we have to factor in regional transport and interstate transport. Long haul drivers, they don't have the support out there for that.
Right.
The charging
So it's not
infrastructure
a-
doesn't exist.
This question of revenue raising is not much of an issue then for the heavy vehicles. But there's a paucity of charging stations, isn't there? Matt Keane at one time announced that cooperative initiative up and down the Hume Highway with the Victorian government, I think about $20 million into it,
Yeah.
to have heavy vehicle charging stations, and then nothing happened.
Yeah.
It was one of his schemes that remained a dream. So how many charging stations would there be up and down the Hume Highway, for example, for heavy vehicle EVs?
I don't have
No.
a figure, but there's not really
No.
much out there, and plus the actual road infrastructure itself
Right.
is
They
lacking.
need a different type of charging station, do they, than the light vehicles?
Yes,
Cars?
yeah,
Right.
yeah. They need purpose built.
Right.
They need purpose built.
There's no way they can hook into a
Infrastructure.
car type system. No.
No, they'll need something a bit
Right.
more industrial, if you will. There is support for depot-based charging. Government is handing out
Depot-based,
grants for heavy vehicle depots to establish charging in their depots, but that will only go so far.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll need more support out on the roads.
Okay. Thank you for your answers.
Can I ask, we had, I think it was the road freight group in last hearing, and they were talking about basically companies that had multiple depots in different states would be able to just register all of their vehicles in a different state to avoid New South Wales's road user charge. How feasible is that for example, in rideshare and other sort of uses of, or category of user that is covered by your union, in terms of, like how easy is it for somebody to just register their car in a different state and have it and drive it commercially in New South Wales?
Realistically, I don't see that as a long-term solution for our members, and I don't think if somebody was sitting, if you're a rideshare driver and you're considering doing that, you're just going to turn away from EVs, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. This idea of a commercial exemption, again, thinking about rideshare, how would that apply if you were using your car sometimes for commercial reasons and sometimes not? How do you perceive that would, or how do you foresee that would actually logistically work in terms of claiming an exemption?
That's a good question. Kilometres are monitored, so they have to declare what they're doing really, and Uber or any platform they're engaged with would be aware of what the driver's movements are. So I don't think you'd be getting very far if you're trying to fudge it, not long term.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to Mr. Latham's question about the tracking and the privacy. If you've got if you begin to exclude certain kilometres from the charge, then what is it that the government will expect in terms of how you justify that, I guess, and how you monitor it with tracking devices and other things?
Yeah, well, we are living in a bit of a era where surveillance is becoming more and more of a thing. But I will say, at least anecdotally, that when a driver in transport tries to get away with some shady kilometre business, it doesn't tend to last very long. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Uber drivers already have GPS tracking, I think, and So
yeah, what they do is monitored, and they wouldn't get very far, I think, if they try to pull something shifty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we had the constitutional lawyers in last hearing, they were talking about one way to sort of bolster the legislation to make it less likely to have a constitutional challenge would be to broaden out away from just distance-based and consider other types of factors that might go into the charge. and the one that kept coming up was kind of the weight of the vehicle. We had subsequent witnesses who were talking about you could also have some form of progressive charge for people who didn't live near public transport, or there was some other reason, and you could even include, for instance, the cost of, or the relative cost of emissions from an EV versus other types of vehicles. Have you given any thought to sort of, I guess any models and how you might feel about a model that doesn't just include distance-based?
Well, hearing the idea of, say, a charge that is based on the weight of a vehicle, it raises a few alarm bells in my head, but I'm thinking heavy vehicles. That's outside of this. I think it's certainly feasible. Then it just becomes. I'd have to see in practice how the mechanisms would work and what they proposed. I can't profess to have really thought about things like weight-based charges too much myself, but if the formula and projected figures could be considered more reasonable for our members, and we'd certainly be open to say facilitating that or looking into it.
Yeah. And another idea, I think, is and this keeps coming up in other inquiries as well, is basically the inconsistencies between the multiple charges you have on our vehicles, whether it's your registration charge, even the stamp duty that you pay on a vehicle, and then you've got your excise duty, and now you can have your road user charge. And they all seem quite inconsistent and not necessarily equitable. If instead this was to be rolled into an annual charge per vehicle, so that you had an extra amount put on there that would cover your anticipated road user charge, would that be a more attractive model than this kind of distance-based model?
I'd say it's likely, purely because I'd imagine the overall cost would be significantly less than a distance-based one, or at least I'd like to think so. So for our members, in terms of a lived experience situation, I would say it'd be better. But what that looks like in practice, I suppose, remains to be seen. In my head, I imagine it's less than a distance-based charge, just because of how far and how often these people are driving. It sounds more attractive to me in concept.
Yeah, one of the concerns we had when we were debating this last 5 years ago, whatever it was, I remember at the time some stakeholders saying it would be particularly difficult if they ended up with effectively a bill shock. So they hadn't calculated, unlike fuel where you go and you pay for it at the Bowser and then you know how much you've paid and you drive until it's run out. The idea that your road user charge would be accumulating over time, and you may get a bit of bill shock when it all comes in to let you know what you've been sort of charged that quarter or that year or however they end up doing it. Has there been any thought, I guess, given from your members as to, sort of a different way of doing things?
Just have to forgive me, I have to clarify something.
Yeah.
Was the idea here for the distance-based charge to apply and then come in one lump sum?
So I believe that the way they have it at the moment is that it was annual. Someone will have to remind me what the actual Act currently says. But yeah, from an implementation perspective,
That would definitely be bill shock.
yeah, maybe they ended up putting in a portion, because I remember we had this,
I think
apologies.
It's all to the regs, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe it is all in the regs. Anyway, so yeah.
Well, that would be a confronting situation, I think, for any commercial vehicle driver.
Yes.
Yeah.
I understand it's the General Carriers Contract Determination 2017, the GCCD,
Yes.
where there's a per kilometre rate in relation to the excise, or there's basically a certain per kilometre rate which is paid to the driver or the operator. Could that be, I guess, could an RUC be sort of included within that instead? Could you have that as how feasible would it be from a logistical perspective to be able to claim back, I guess, the RUC?
Well, currently under the GCCD, the actual cost recovery mechanisms available to owner operators is limited, and in a lot of cases, they may see some cost recovery, but that's generally on a per contract basis, which isn't necessarily the industry standard.
Yeah, okay.
To claim back on this potential road user charge, I suppose, could be if we get some cost recovery, that'd be great. Just how that's actually employed.
And again, then it's that timing issue, I guess, of you've got, the road user charge becomes payable at a certain time. You presumably have to pay it and then try and claim it back.
Yeah.
And there's I guess it would depend on how it works in practice.
Yeah.
Did you have any questions?
Was I suppose related questioning to my colleague Abigail Boyd regarding the equity issue, Daniel, which is the kind of substance of your submission and evidence, I guess. Would there be a way to perhaps attenuate the inequity by tailoring it for, I don't know, turnover or something? So if you're a rideshare person or a food delivery driver and you've got a very low turnover or very low margins, you could perhaps have some sort of discount based on that. Would that be something that could work?
Yeah, I think it's feasible. The only question mark for me there is that we do see variance in how efficient certain drivers can be. It obviously depends on where you're driving and where you're mainly based out of. Like, for example, if you're at the airport, you tend to be getting good business. But if you're in outer suburbs and things like that, it's not as consistent. So there's going to be some variance there in between who is benefiting the most and who isn't in rideshare. But it's definitely an option for sure. I wouldn't discount it completely. I think it's definitely relevant, depending on where.
What determines those patches? Is that just a function of, it's just a market? Like if you want to hang around the airport, you get the work. If you don't, you don't. Is that kind of how it works? Or
Yeah, more or less, but it's also very algorithm based. So sometimes it's about where you can get a job and where you can't, and yeah, there are a lot of factors that go into it. But it's primarily algorithm led. You can hang around the airport if you want, but it's not necessarily that simple. Yeah.
And in your view, would this, in its current form, would this discourage your members in that sort of precarious area, rideshare, food delivery, from taking up electric charging vehicles and stick to traditional internal combustion engines? Like, do your members sort of saying, well, we're thinking about doing it, but we're not going to now, given this pending charge? Will it retard that transition?
I think it's likely to. Best case scenario, if it does disincentivize, say, any of the drivers that are considering a transition, they may still adopt hybrid vehicles if they haven't already. That's a strong growing component, but it is likely to disincentivize drivers who are considering adopting an EV. A lot of interest comes from rideshare platforms themselves as well. I understand that Uber has in recent times done a partnership with, I don't know, you'll have to forgive me, I've forgotten the organisation's name, but they've done a partnership to roll out Polestar 2 vehicle leases, which are EVs, to Uber drivers. So I understand there's still initiatives and I suppose interest from the actual rideshare operators, but as a driver yourself, yeah, you're probably going to look at the road user charge and then consider how much it's going to set you back. For food delivery, it probably wouldn't be as bad, but I don't think food delivery drivers are primarily the target audience here anyway. It'd mostly be rideshare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any further questions? No, I think we're all good. Thank you so much for attending today. To the extent there are any supplementary questions, the Committee Secretariat will be in touch, but that concludes our time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll just take a short break until 10:15. Okay, we'll now welcome our next witnesses. If I could ask each of you to please state your name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation, and I'll start with you, Professor Pink.
Yes, my name's, I'm Distinguished Professor Sarah Pink. I'm Director of the Emerging Technologies Lab at Monash University. And I will use the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Kaviani?
I'm Fareed Kaviani. I'm a research fellow at the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University. I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would either of you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, I'll make one, yes.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so I want to preface this by giving some context about my expertise, because I think it might be a bit different from the experts you've been speaking to before. So I'm a design and futures anthropologist, and that means that I research how we live in the present and in possible futures. It doesn't involve forecast or prediction, but it delivers what we understand as plausible and realistic knowledge about how people's values and priorities will shape how they live in possible futures and the possible outcomes of that. Now, I also want to start by clarifying that I'm not here to recommend that the revenue changes go ahead. My view is always that adequate social research is required before any changes that will impact the lives of everyday people are delivered is undertaken. But having prefaced it with that, where futures anthropology insight can respond is in proposing that if these changes do go ahead, that they should be shaped to support inclusive, trusted and ethical mobilities futures, and that they're generative for a clean energy transition. Now, I also believe that this should be based on attention to real people's values and priorities, and to how a revenue system could support electric vehicle uptake as part of an anticipatory journey towards renewable and clean energy futures. I know that's a big ask when we're thinking about an act, right? But I believe it's important to consider this. So one of the questions I would ask then is, what do taxes need to support in order to subsequently support an inclusive, trusted and ethical renewable and clean energy transition? And I just want to mention 6 points relating to that very briefly. So the first point I want to make is that, according to our research, lack of public charging infrastructure is not the main reason why people don't buy electric vehicles. Our research shows that Australians want to charge their future electric vehicles at home, and that people who live in apartments, who rent or have on-street parking simply can't do so. So most car travel in Australia, as I understand it, is local, and it could be supported by charging electric vehicles at home. So my response to that is that electric vehicle tax should support viable, accessible and safe local charging services at or near people's homes. I'd be happy to take questions around that later as well. Now, the second point is that in 2026, our report that's just about to come out shows that there's a growing priority actually amongst Australians to avoid electric vehicle charging at all. And this appears to have been inspired by people's experience of an exposure to hybrid fossil fuel electric vehicles. It's also generating more interest in wireless automated electric vehicle charging. So my response there is that electric vehicle tax should support future public wireless charging services and the infrastructures to support that, in the anticipatory mode. My third point is that while the energy crisis generated a spike in electric vehicle sales, and generally we find that Australians believe that electric vehicles are inevitable in their future lives, a lot of the participants in our research are actually taking a wait-and-see approach to electric vehicles, cars I mean in that sense. So my point there would be that electric vehicle tax, as it's currently proposed, is actually likely to exacerbate that wait-and-see approach. Fourthly, people are worried about their cybersecurity and their personal data. We found a kind of a spike in those kind of concerns in our most recent piece of qualitative research. So trust in cybersecurity and in digitally enabled electric vehicles, which might calculate and share data about distance travelled, is absolutely vital for that kind of public trust. Now, fifth, in possible futures, we find that people are most likely to trust local community energy sharing and electric vehicle charging initiatives. So my point there is that electric vehicle tax should visibly fund the local and community assets that would support those kinds of systems and the cost-saving implications that people associate with them. And finally, my sixth point is that electric vehicles are unaffordable for many people. In fact, they were unaffordable for nearly all of the participants in our most recent piece of research. The only car-based future one of our older participants could imagine would be sleeping in her car if her family could no longer support her. So electric vehicle tax should be inclusive. It should be means tested, and it should actually enable electric vehicle use by people who are already living in situations of vulnerability. So those are my opening thoughts and statements. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kaviani, did you want to also make a statement, or is it a joint statement?
No, I have no opening statement. But
Great.
Thank you.
Well, that is fascinating, and there's a lot that I think we should really get into. Can I just ask, this research about people really want to charge at home, that quite resonates with me. I've had a plug-in hybrid for, 6 or 7 years, and I have never once charged it outside of the home because I have anxiety over how I would do that, and I don't know where I would go, and it all seems very difficult, but plugging it in once I get home is just super easy. Can you give us a bit more kind of, information around that research that you've done, and any more details about what people are saying about that?
Yeah, so our first piece of research is reported in our Digital Energy Futures Foresights for Future Living reports. That's freely available, and I can also send those links to you. We did ethnographic research with 72 households across Australia, which is a massive sample for qualitative research. And we also did workshops with 42 participants, some of whom overlapped. Now, there's lots of interesting questions around that. One is about safety. It's about personal safety. So why would you want to go and charge your electric vehicle at a charging station at night when maybe you forgot to charge it? Going to get petrol is one thing. Takes a short period of time. Charging publicly takes time. But of course, there's also the question of access to public charging facilities near home. We don't know, where are they? How do you access them? Do you have to wait for them? Some people, there's also some distrust, well, maybe sometimes they're free at the moment, or maybe they're free in supermarkets or other places, or low cost at the moment. Will the cost go up? So again, lots of uncertainties. And we also found that people didn't want to have ugly public charging infrastructures in their towns, which was another important and key point. I think, but one of the most important things is that emphasis on the local, making local accessible, and making it worth it for people. I think that a lot of people use electric vehicles for local travel. So while there's this myth that the reason why people won't buy electric vehicles is because there isn't a public charging infrastructure for long distance travel, our everyday priorities are not usually shaped around needing to do long distance trips. They're usually around getting the kids to school on time, getting to work on time, being able to do the shopping, being able to transport family members around the local environment. So I think for me, that question around the local, around community is really, really important. We also found that people in our most recent study, we found that people were interested in community charging, in sharing energy in communities, and that's where they found most of their trust as well. People were worried about theft of their energy even. So we're kind of also moving to this quite complex digital kind of situation where there are opportunities for digital energy trading. There are opportunities for wireless electric vehicle charging, maybe embedded in road infrastructures or in parking infrastructures. So for me, there are, in this kind of complex situation, there's what could happen now, but there's also this kind of future readiness. that we need to see. And I think because for so many people purchasing an electric vehicle is an anticipatory situation, we need to think about how any kind of revenue could be made meaningful in terms of that anticipatory journey towards how they would like their energy and electric vehicle futures to intersect. Right, I know that's quite complex, and I hope I've made that accessible.
I think all of that is really interesting. I'm just thinking about this wireless technology, which, when you sort of sit back and think about it, seems quite like an obvious sort of where we will end up going to. Could that sort of wireless charging, and I'm picturing, I don't know how realistic it is that people could be driving along on roads that would be wirelessly charging them at the same time. But would that sort of thing act as an incentive? We talk a lot about the idea of a road user charge being a disincentive, but how much of it would be a disincentive if you felt you were getting something back in the terms of, in terms of infrastructure that was charging your car at the same time? Are those two things connected?
I can't comment on exactly how people would put those things together because we haven't necessarily asked them directly, right? But I think that there could definitely be that really interesting relationship between seeing that charge as being part of the provision of something which would enable you to be able to use your electric vehicle in a way that avoided the difficulty of charging it. The other thing that I want to highlight as well, which I didn't mention earlier, is often very often when these new technological systems are introduced, then they break down, they don't work properly. I think also a lot of reassurance around actually how things will be fixed is another key element there.
One final question that I'll hand over to my colleagues. So just coming back to this point, I think it was your point 5, this visibly funding the assets. One of the bits of feedback we had from the constitutional lawyers at our last hearing was that for this charge to be perhaps constitutionally more robust, we should look at making it very clearly a fee for service, and it going into even sort of into this kind of hypothecation, into some sort of bucket that then gets spent back on the roads. What can you talk through a bit more about what you were imagining when you talk about this kind of visible kind of, I guess, signal back to the community about what the charge is funding?
Yes, because I think we've found that people do compare services, and they compare cost when they select their electric vehicle. When they buy a car, people like to compare costs and to calculate. Some people, not all people. And I think that making services that will be provided visible, and in terms of what those visible assets would be, again, some of this is about a co-design process with communities, right? So I don't want to really hypothesize exactly what those kinds of services might look like, but in order to be able to have community energy trading schemes, then infrastructures need to be put in place, which would be digital infrastructures, platforms, trusted ways of performing transactions. So some of these questions are kind of what kind of trusted organisation would provide those platforms? Where would that come from? So I think that's one example. I think Fareed might have more comments because Fareed has actually ran the survey, which worked with a much wider group of participants through our project and has other expertise as well.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I could start in terms of the charging access, just to add some pertinent points to that, that we found 81% of apartment residents actually lack charging access from the survey of over 5,000 households across Australia. So that's a large percentage. And when you bring that together with the preference for charging at home, that is a large barrier to EV adoption. For detached housing, 58% have charging access, and semi-detached housing 49%. So only 19% of apartment dwellers actually have access to EV charging infrastructure. In terms of the broader, more demographic findings of that particular survey, we found that only 9% of the respondents had electric vehicles, but we also asked if people were anticipating purchasing an electric vehicle in the next 5 years or in 5+ years. For renters, that was very low, but overall, the desire to purchase an EV in the next 5 years was not as high as we expected it to be. In fact, a majority of people had no plans at all to purchase an electric vehicle in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. So one of the reasons is for that access to home charging. I think also in terms of preferences around charging, people do prefer to use their own solar to charge. It goes with the cheapest way possible to charge. To use renewable energy is also a major preference in terms of charging. And so we see a lot of households that own EVs also have solar, and there's a move toward also having home batteries, so they're able to use their own energy to charge their vehicles. And so this also contributes towards the preference for charging at home, so they're able to use their own energy. And that's something that we found that across the board, that people do want to use renewable energy sources when they think about charging their electric vehicles. Yeah.
And does that also include, I guess, people using their car as a battery, like as a home battery, effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a key point too when thinking about this particular legislation, that thinking about the electric vehicles are not only just vehicles, they're also becoming mobile energy assets, if you like. So they have a dual purpose. And we see that a lot of households are anticipating using their electric vehicles to power their homes through vehicle to home technology, sorry. But it also is a form of resilience through disruption. They see it as providing that certainty that they have access to energy during times of disruption, which is going to become even more pertinent in future, where climate forecasts of more disruptive weather events, people will be relying on that, on their EVs to provide energy for their homes during grid disruption. So that's also another key consideration around how can transport policy work in unison with energy policy for them both to be mutually supportive. So when thinking about things like distance-based tariffs, another thing to consider is time of charging as well. Time of charging has a big impact on the grid, and it's a key uncertainty in terms of how much energy will be used, and there's a desire for people to charge when solar is most available, so in the middle of the day. So perhaps how can we incentivize that type of charging behaviour too, is something to consider.
Interesting. I'll go to Mrs. Mitchell.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you both for being here and for your evidence so far. I just had a couple of questions. I think, Professor Pink, you said, talking about your quantitative study, that it was about 70 odd families that you worked with. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, so in our first study, we worked with 72 households ethnographically, and then we did workshops with 72 participants ethnographically. Then we worked with 42 participants in our workshops, some of whom overlapped with the ethnographic study. In our
And
most
just in terms of the background, I guess, of those families and, or households, where they were from and the breakdown, I guess, of sort of metro, regional, or was it concentrated? I'm just kind of curious about your data set, really,
Yeah, I just want to add as well, in our most recent study, which is the one Fareed is also commenting on, he talked about the survey, which was for 5,000 Australians. We also did qualitative research with, I had to actually check the report. I think it was with 48 participants or something. I don't know if you know, Fareed, is it 48? Yeah.
48 participants.
Yes. So in our first study with the 72 households, and that was across Victoria and New South Wales. Our most recent study is across all of Australia. And in our most recent study, more of our participants were low income. In our first study, then we had a very diverse sample, trying to seek, diverse sample across all Australians in Victoria and New South Wales, and also not just urban, but urban and remote regional participants,
Okay.
I mean, I think that reflecting, of course, some of those issues are different for those kinds of participants, right? And of course, depending on what part of Australia you're living in, then the questions are different as well. So one of the points also for people living in areas that were at risk of weather events and climate change events, then, for example, some of those participants didn't even feel it was viable for them to have an electric vehicle because they felt much more confident that a fossil fuel vehicle would have petrol in it or be ready for them to drive out if they needed to in the event of a bushfire or something like that. So I think, again, there's many different issues for people living in different places, but we have tried to accommodate all of those and account for them in our research.
Yeah, great. No, and that's good to hear. It's good to sort of, because again, we're hearing evidence with sort of differing viewpoints on some of the challenges, I guess, for people accessing these vehicles. And then I just have one more question, if I can, Chair. And I think you sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but you mentioned in your opening statement the cybersecurity and data concerns that came through from some of your participants. Again, we've had that on the first day of this hearing as well from other witnesses. I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit more in terms of what you were hearing from people about those concerns.
Yeah, look, cybersecurity concerns seem to be growing from a whole range of perspectives. And I think we're in the context where AI has been generating an increasing amount of distrust. But of course, we know that trust in institutions is low as well. But also we found that there's an increase of people working from home, which also reflects on that question of so much more in life being home-centred, and then the cybersecurity concerns about home digital systems. Of course, then as the car becomes more digital as well, then concerns around data security are likely to increase in that context as well. So I think we're living in a context where cybersecurity is a growing concern for Australians broadly, and that we need to accommodate that and consider that in those situations. And I think that then again takes us back to community as being somewhere where people are actually going to be more confident about digital transactions because they know who they're making those transactions with. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Chair. That's all I had.
Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Chair, if I could ask Professor Pink and also Dr. Caviani, you've done a lot of research about Australian attitudes to EVs. One of the statistics that stands out is that Australia has the highest rooftop solar rate in the world, but the lowest EV take-up rate. Here in New South Wales at the moment, or back in November, it's less than 9%, although that's a long way up on 1% in 2020. And the state government here, the Treasurer, has abandoned the 50% target by 2030. So I suppose there'll be a boost to EVs because of the Middle East crisis and impact on petrol prices. But what do you think, where do you think the EV level of new car sales every year will settle? And what are the main positives and negatives in this reality?
I think I'd first make a comment about this kind of spike in EV uptake due to the fuel crisis. I think one of the issues there is that still doesn't make EVs any more accessible to those people who currently can't afford them and currently would find it difficult to charge them. And we really need to keep that in mind, that there is the inaccessibility of electric vehicles to such a large sector of the Australian population is, I think, for me, one of the key issues that we need to account for. I don't know if you three have more to comment on that from the survey findings. I think you might have a better vision of the question around the solar uptake.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had 9% that currently owned EV, 18% planned to purchase one in the next 5 years, but over 50% had no plans whatsoever to purchase an EV. Bear in mind that this survey was prior to the current crisis, but we have just finished administering another survey. So we're running this survey once a year for the next 3 years as a part of the Scenarios for Future Living project. Haven't got those results in, but it will be very interesting to see how events over the past year have impacted those figures around EV and also around home batteries with the battery rebates. So all of these technologies are interconnected in terms of if people have solar, then they are more likely to want to have EVs to charge to use their own solar. I think also it's interesting to think about how the current crisis has increased the desire for EVs, but then there could be the flip side where energy instability, as Professor Pink mentioned, increases the desire for the perceived reliability of plug-in hybrids or fossil fuels. So there is that inverse relationship also. But I think in terms of the low EV rates, as mentioned, the desire for home charging and lack of access to home charging, especially around multi-unit dwellings, apartment buildings, more dense areas, the lack of access to charging is a real disincentivizer for people to purchase EVs.
And in terms of the subject matter of our inquiry, road user charges, what does your survey data show about community attitudes? People sort of say, oh, well, that's fair enough because of fuel excise for petrol-type cars, or is it a substantial barrier to affordability and EV take-up rates?
And to the actual legislation, we didn't cover those aspects in the survey, but I guess it does speak to as Professor Pink mentioned, the broader equity access to these technologies. We found that people in the higher income brackets were more likely to own EVs and to want to purchase EVs in the future, but a very low percentage, I think it was 4% of households that earn under 40,000 per annum, only 4% currently owns an electric vehicle. So there's a real access issue there too.
Yeah, that's reflected in the data we had here in New South Wales. The current government's abandoned the purchase subsidies and put the money into charging stations. They're relying on the Commonwealth subsidies instead. But I asked some questions about the postcodes of where the purchase subsidies were going, and overwhelmingly they were middle to higher income parts of New South Wales, right through the band of the North Shore, particularly around the Hills district, but very, very little in Western Sydney. So I suppose that's just an economic reality, isn't it?
Yeah. And on that point around income disparity to EV ownership, 71% of households that earn less than 40,000 per annum have no plans to purchase an EV, and that's compared to 28% of households earning over 240,000 have no plans. So that's a huge gap.
Thank you.
So just on, sorry, did you?
Yep, if possible.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Just wanting to, one of the tenets we've had in this inquiry is in terms of timing. One argument is that you want to go early because if you don't, then there'll be a bit of a shock from users later on who will say, oh, we didn't see this coming, and take that out of their equation. The other argument is that you don't want to go too early because you want to get to a critical mass, and therefore you're going to get to a period where you can have higher adoption of EVs. Just interested from your research whether you think that there is either a reason to move earlier so that people don't find a shock when they get 2 years down to having an EV and then find that they get that $600 bill, or whether there's an argument that it should be delayed further to stop some of that that aversion to purchasing an EV?
I think that given the kind of low trust in institutions, the possibility that a charge will be levied later on once somebody's already bought their electric vehicle is going to be a deterrent in terms of initial kind of uptake and purchase of electric vehicles. So that, in many respects, could generate more problems, right? I think transparency and visibility is important. So this is not giving you an either way answer, I'm
Sure.
afraid, but if it's not possible to demonstrate that the taxes will actually have generative and positive outcomes for people and communities that are visible to them and they can see, I can also see that as being problematic. So I think that it's very much about the way in which any taxes are delivered, how they're used, and how that's made visible, how that's made valuable to people and to communities is important. But I think the cost questions are also a deterrent to anybody considering purchasing an electric vehicle, especially in a current cost of living crisis as well, and the uncertainties surrounding that. So I would just urge you to keep those questions in mind.
Thank you, Professor Pink. Also, I guess you talked about those who are in the wait and see category, and you've talked about things like wireless charging and the like. Technologies that aren't necessarily here just yet. I know there might be a wireless charging highway, I think, in Florida for a stretch or the like, but these are not sort of common technologies. In terms of hypothecating any road user charge, how much do you think needs to be weighted to some of the problems of today? So, for instance, you've outlined people who are wanting to charge at home, people in apartment buildings who don't have charging infrastructure, as opposed to some of the things that might make EV usage better in the future. So things like wireless charging facilities or upgrading highways that would have wireless charging as part of them. What sort of mix should government be looking at from your perspective?
I would say ideally both, but I would say that the without resolving the current problem that many people can't afford electric vehicles, and even if they could, they wouldn't be able to charge them locally or at home or near their homes, is the most pressing issue for enabling electric vehicle uptake at the moment. And I know that most of the focus is on providing public charging facilities, and I know there's an underlying assumption that that is what will encourage electric vehicle uptake. But I would really urge consideration of what we've been emphasising about the importance to people being able to charge in or very close to their homes. in terms of encouraging interest in electric vehicle uptake, even if that won't necessarily make it affordable. But I think Fareed might have further comments on those questions.
Yeah, just on the question around the timing, I think it's interesting too, because as I mentioned before, electric vehicles aren't just about transport. They're also perceived and anticipated as a home battery, as providing that resilience during more forecasts of climate disruption. So I think thinking about it in terms of how can transport policy support energy policy and vice versa is a consideration in the timing of this, which is also complicated by the fact that we're currently in the throes of an energy transition. So these types of policies, how can these policies be designed to support the energy transition and to reduce some of the uncertainties that the energy sector is currently grappling with in terms of their forecast for future energy demands, and some of those uncertainties and unknowns around when people will be charging, what time will they be charging, and could there be mass charging events such as prior to a disruptive event. Perhaps everybody will want to charge their EVs at the same time, causing an override because they want to ensure that they have that backup for not only their homes but also for mobility. So I guess that goes some way, not necessarily to answer your question in terms of the timing of the policy, but how can transport policy be mutually supportive of energy policy, I guess is my point.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kaviani. To that point, I guess that some of those issues you've raised perhaps make us think a little bit more about charging. Now, of course, we're doing this inquiry on road user charges, and the hypothecated model is in terms of distance travelled. Is there perhaps a better argument in terms of actually having something levied at an electricity usage or consumption point rather than actually in the road user from your perspective? And is that perhaps a more equitable way to look at how we treat these vehicles?
I guess, as I mentioned before, what's important for the energy grid is the timing of charging, to encourage people to charge during the middle of the day when the sun is high and there's an abundance of solar. Currently, people are more likely to charge when it's convenient for them, which can contribute to peak demand at the end of the day when they come home. So there is an opportunity to think about how the legislation could encourage charging at times that is beneficial to the grid or to maintain grid stability, but it's also important to consider the ability of people to charge at times that is supported to the grid. Sometimes people only have the option to charge at particular times, and I guess you don't want to inadvertently punish them for not being able to charge at the middle of the day if they don't have access to charging points. So I guess a multi-pronged approach, more charging stations at places of work, perhaps, increasing access to charging will enable perhaps charging at times that is beneficial to the grid.
Thank you. And last question from me, Dr. Kaviani, and this goes back to the discussion you're having with Mr. Latham in terms of the adoption of EVs and where they are adopted. And I think the figure you cited was about 4% of households with income less than $40,000 looking at having an adoption of EVs, not actually owning one at the moment, but even considering it. Just in terms of that research and both the qualitative data you're doing and the 5,000 strong research across the country, what were the attitudes from that research in terms of EV owners, and was there an expectation or a demand for some form of equity in the charges that EV owners were faced with compared to those who might have internal combustion engines, who at present are paying a road user charge effectively through the fuel excise? Was there any sort of opinions on that you gained?
I don't think we didn't look into attitudes or to compare between internal combustion engine owners and EV owners. I think what was interesting was in terms of people's motivations for purchasing an EV, which was really primarily around the environmental benefits, and then it was around the costs. So the lower costs associated with electric vehicles, and also the ability to use one's own solar, which therefore reduces costs overall. Again, so yeah, I think perhaps Professor Peck has insights from the qualitative findings.
We didn't, in the qualitative research either, really compare that question around the difference in costs.
Okay.
No, so I don't
That's
think
right.
I can really answer that.
Thank you. No worries.
Did you have a question?
Just following up on that. So this inequity issue's been raised by a number of witnesses over the course of the inquiry. Presumably that barrier is based on a large upfront capital investment, I guess. If you're struggling to make ends meet and you've got to fork out X amount extra. So is there some merit in the government considering a progressive system whereby lower income earners would be incentivised to take up by getting a greater sort of subsidy for it?
That's a possibility. I don't think I can answer it either way. I think it's a question of making electric vehicles actually affordable, rather, I suppose, incentivising with a greater subsidy could make electric vehicles affordable, but if it doesn't, then it wouldn't work, I suppose, is my sense on that, right? But it's not a question that we've actually asked people, so we couldn't give you a definitive answer
I
on
guess
that.
the question is that
Yeah.
if it's, what did you say, it was 4% of people under whatever the threshold income was, then there would be a view amongst people who have an undying faith in the market that, well, if the market sorts it out eventually, the cost of those vehicles will come down because it's cheaper to run in the long run, but that might take much, much longer than we'd otherwise like for our net zero ambitions and all the rest of it. So the question has to be for government, is it worthwhile looking at skewing it in favour of low income earners so that take-up's higher?
I think it's an interesting point, but it's also useful to think about it in the context of energy hardship and the rates of energy hardship. We found that over 38% of households are experiencing some form of energy hardship. That's being unable to afford other essentials, can't pay the electricity bill on time, can't afford to use heating when it's needed, having to ask friends for help to pay their electricity bills. So that's a huge percentage. 38% of Australian households experience some form of energy hardship. So when we're thinking about incentivising EV ownership, we also have to consider it within that context of being unable to actually pay your electricity bills. simultaneously, something that's quite interesting and important to anticipate when thinking about energy hardship in electric vehicles is people living in climate risk zones. We found that a large percentage, almost 40% of households self-reported living in a climate risk zone. And what that means is they live in places that are at risk of heavy storms and cyclones, prone to blackouts, flood zones, and in coastal areas at risk from climate change. The interesting thing is that we found they're compounding factors. People that live in climate risk zones are also more likely to experience energy hardship. And that's only going to become more intensified in the future with more climate risks, more disruptions, higher energy costs. The people that are at risk of climate disruptions are also perhaps least equipped to be able to mitigate some of the impacts of that, such as having their air conditioning on during heat waves, etc. I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but I guess it does speak to the equity aspect and the complexities around incentivizing one technology when there's within the context of these broadening and widening hardship and perhaps the compounding issues into the future.
Could I just ask a question in relation to the cyber the technology risk or the cybersecurity and privacy issues? Professor Pink, you did mention in your opening statement some issues around this, and I sort of wanted to unpick how much of it is cybersecurity concerns and how much of it is concerns around sort of tracking and privacy. And I ask that because I instantly sort of get the ick at the idea of someone knowing exactly where I'm going, but I'm quite happy to say how many kilometres I travel. But I would like to be in sort of charge of that rather than it going directly to somebody for them to then have that information straight from my car. What are other people saying? What is the kind of sentiment out there in relation to those issues?
I think there was a kind of a general security and crime fear amongst some of our participants. So, but the reported experience of themselves or knowing people or hearing about, phishing scams, hacking, other forms of data theft and extraction, surveillance technologies, the use of drones. So some of the households had kind of adopted these, what we call layered security strategies. So they had surveillance devices, they had cybersecurity practices that they'd developed. They might have disengaged from being digitally connected at certain times. And a lot of these are kind of their own kind of inventions of their own systems to keep themselves kind of cyber safe. But yes, I mean, there were a whole series of things that people did, like changing their passwords continuously, using VPNs, using multi-factor authentication modes, internal cameras, or not installing cameras or installing them. So lots of different fears and concerns, and I wouldn't say that they were always the same fear or concern, but they were kind of jumbled up a little bit in terms of what that particular person had experienced, and what they knew other people experienced, and what measures they were taking. I mean, Fareed might have some more wide-ranging findings to report from the survey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And also from a analysis of over 90 reports that we did, energy reports, government reports, technology reports, to see what types of trends are emerging, and including technology trends and social trends. And definitely the declining trust in institutions and technology was a ubiquitous finding across many of the reports, and it was viewed as a barrier to adoption of emerging technologies because of people's concerns around privacy and security, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence. The ability of AI to enable hyper-personalization of products and services, but then on the flip side, to enable hyper-personalization of scams. The growth of misinformation, of deep fakes, and it being exacerbated by AI. So the ability to have these things automated was something that we found throughout these reports, and it can be seen in the suspicion towards smart technologies, smart meters, the rejection of smart meters, and also fears around cyber attacks on emerging energy technologies or technologies in the future. So cyber attacks on home energy systems is an anticipated concern across the energy sector. So that therefore comes out in a rejection of some of these technologies within the home, and contributes to the broader suspicion or rejection of smart appliances, but also automated technologies in the home. People want control over their technologies. We found that in our research in the survey, although people will accept some form of smart technology, ultimately they want to have control over these technologies. I think only 4%, we asked the question around, would you be willing to have smart technology in your home that's automated, smart energy technology, sorry, that's automated, so a third party can take over control to help stabilize the grid. We found only 4% said yes. 84% said yes, smart appliances, but with manual override. So ultimately, people want control over these technologies, but they also want to they want to have that insurance that the technologies, support their safety and security without encroaching on their privacy.
I mean, I would add that has been a consistent finding in our qualitative research across many projects that we've worked on, and particularly the Digital Energy Futures project I mentioned before, and the Current Scenarios for Future Living project, which we've undertaken that I've mentioned at the moment. People want to stay in control of automated technologies. They want to be able to be notified if anything's going to happen. They want to be able to give consent. And those things, so when I was earlier talking about wireless electric vehicle charging, well, we hadn't asked people if they would want to give consent for their electric vehicles to be wirelessly charged. My assumption is that, of course, these principles around maintaining control of the way that any digital or automated or artificial intelligence technology interacts with you and your electric vehicle or your home is a general principle that I think would need to be or should be applied when considering introduction of any emerging technology.
Great, thank you. Were there any final questions? No? Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today. That's been incredibly interesting and useful. To the extent there were questions taken on notice or supplementary questions coming from members, the Committee Secretariat will be in touch. But that does conclude our time with you today. Thank you. And now the committee will be taking a break until 11:30 a.m.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. get started again. Just bring broadcast back. Fabulous. I now welcome our next witnesses. If I could please ask each of you to state your name and position title, followed by the oath or the affirmation. And I'll start with you, Dr. Watson.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Dr. Sean Watson. I'm a neurologist based in Sydney. I'm on the board of Doctors for the Environment Australia, and I'm the Deputy Chair of the New South Wales Committee of Doctors for the Environment Australia. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Heal.
Hello, my name's Dr. Felicity Heal. I'm a general practitioner based in Melbourne and a member of Doctors for the Environment Australia. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And would you like to begin with a short opening statement?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Good morning. Doctors for the Environment Australia is an apolitical grouping of doctors. We advocate for policy that improves health and climate outcomes. We thank the committee for this opportunity to share our views on the New South Wales road user charge. We would support a well-designed charge that produces community co-benefits. 4 areas we want to highlight for consideration when designing the policy are tailpipe exhausts, carbon emissions, transport equity, and vehicle design categories. We advise against policy settings that could impede uptake of battery vehicles or create perverse incentives favouring ICE or hybrid vehicles. There are significant and often under-recognised health and productivity costs from tailpipe exhausts. Policy that promotes rapid electrification of transport is essential. Health impacts from a warming climate are increasing and of concern to us. We advocate for equitable access to clean transport and clean air regardless of socioeconomic status or location. A well-designed road user policy would prevent or reduce transport poverty and inequitable health outcomes. We endorse policy settings that include vehicle design and weight. Bonnet height is relevant to pedestrian safety and vehicle mass to cost fairness when considering impacts from heavy vehicles on roads. While a flat cents per kilometre rate may be administratively efficient in calculating the charge, we do not consider it the best or only method. Likewise, absorbing monies into consolidated revenue is not well targeted towards future public benefit from the charge. Optimal policy would promote broad uptake of fully electric, lighter vehicles with lower bonnet designs. We recommend revenue is used towards EV charging networks because charging infrastructure is known to increase EV uptake. We also support using revenue to expand, for example, public transport into underserved areas and to improve road safety in New South Wales. Thank you for listening. We welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. I will start with a few and then I'll throw open to my colleagues. I think we've had this discussion in the last hearing around the fuel excise and I guess what its purpose is. And I understand that once upon a time it was actually hypothecated and put into upkeeping roads. Notionally at least, but that's no longer the case other than a small part of it. But growing up, I certainly always thought that the excise was to do with the fact that, these petrol cars were very polluting and had an impact on the environment and on our health and all the rest of it. Now, there is now this argument, which on the face of it makes a lot of sense, that if you've got fuel, the fuel excise applying to people who are using petrol in order for it to pay towards their use of the roads, then you should have the same thing for EV drivers with a road user charge. But of course, that then I guess ignores all of the other pros and cons of different types of vehicles and their sort of external costs on things like health and the environment. So I guess where I'm going with this is, if there was a more complicated road user charge put in place that wasn't just distance-based, and it tried to capture some of those externalities, have you sort of put any thought into what that might look like and how it could be calculated?
We had thought about, well, our primary priority is making fully electric vehicles the most attractive choice. So we would want, if there were a road user charge, for the rate to be set at a level which makes it the more attractive choice over an ICE vehicle or a hybrid vehicle. We had thought along the lines perhaps of a holiday for the road user charge for new entrants into battery electric vehicle use, and perhaps a graded rate so that it's charged at a lower rate in the first, second and third year and goes up to the base rate later on, again to make that more attractive. And we had thought that perhaps weight should be included, or perhaps a vehicle category rather, should be included in the calculation rate for reasons of pedestrian safety and also the greater impacts and just resource use from larger, heavier vehicles.
So we'll come back to that that point around, I guess, SUVs and four-wheel drives. We had another witness make that point in our last hearing as well. But in terms of that sort of health externality, I guess, is there a way to calculate? I take your point about, ideally it's an amount that's calculated to ensure that we have that we incentivize the uptake of EVs. But if we were to look at it on a sort of pure externality basis, is there any data showing, the health impact of a petrol car versus an EV?
There has been some quite comprehensive work done through a group in Melbourne Climate Futures. They have calculated, mainly based upon heavy vehicles, but this can be, of course, extrapolated to include any vehicle that burns fossil fuels. And they have calculated the health impacts of the known health impacts. That doesn't include the unknown health impacts, which are considered to be much larger. But they have considered the direct health costs of emissions to be in the order of 6.2 billion a year to the Australian economy.
So $6.2 billion in health costs from petrol cars in Australia?
They were using heavy vehicles as their
Right.
main calculation point.
Yeah.
But of course, all ICE vehicles burn fuel, but they were calculating direct costs, known costs, which emerged from asthma, respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease to be at least in the order of 6.2 billion per year.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I add to that? Is that
Please.
okay to say? Yeah, there was also another study by the same group a few years ago, which didn't calculate a number in terms of cost in millions or billions, but did look at the direct health impacts of all vehicle emissions across Australia. And that was produced along the same group that Dr. Hill mentioned, Melbourne Climate Futures, but also with Doctors for the Environment Australia and a couple of other advocacy groups. And they calculated an annual death toll of 11,000 per year from from fossil fuel emissions, which was an extrapolation from New Zealand figures and arguably an underestimate. But as you can see, it's way above the road toll, and it's a fairly staggering figure. And they also estimated 12,000 hospital admissions from cardiovascular disease and 66,000 extra asthma cases a year, all from vehicle emissions across the board, light and heavy vehicles. And I think that my understanding is heavy vehicles make up about 25% of emissions. So if you wanted to do just a back of envelope calculation, it would be 6.2 by 4 to give you a rough idea of the overall cost, which is staggering, really.
Thank you. Does that include, so that sounds like it's mainly direct sort of impacts from sort of air pollution impacts as opposed to kind of global warming or climate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's correct. It's just from the air pollution, just from kind of tailpipe emissions.
Thank you. And in relation to this, and it was raised by the Australia Institute in our last hearing as well, this idea of, with data around SUVs and these, I forget what you call them, high front,
Bonnets.
high bonnet vehicles. What is the comparative impact on sort of deaths and injuries from impacts with those types of cars versus ones that aren't? And I guess this is, whether they're electric or not. What's the data?
So it's estimated that if a pedestrian is hit by a light truck type vehicle versus a conventional car, the odds ratio of the person dying is 54% greater for an SUV or high bonnet design vehicle versus a conventional car.
Yeah, right. So I guess if we were designing a system, taking a step back, one of the bits of advice we got in our previous hearing from the constitutional lawyers was that it might be an idea to amend this particular version of a road user charge to make it perhaps a little bit broader than just distance. And so we started talking about externalities at that point. I guess you could conceive of a system, putting the administrative hurdles to one side. We're yet to ask revenue, but we're hoping they'll come and answer these questions for us. If you had a system that was based on sort of the weight of the vehicle, a different sort of category for those with a high bonnet. If you had obviously distance, but you could also perhaps build in some sort of a differential for to account for the health benefits of an EV as well. Perhaps there's a way of charting through some sort of more progressive set of factors for a road user charge?
Yes, we do believe that there is an opportunity in designing this charge to think about other community benefits beyond just revenue raising.
If we were to sorry.
Go on. Because of the growth in these vehicles, it's estimated that now 77% of new vehicle sales in 2022 were SUV types. So that's been a massive increase over the previous rates of these vehicles. And it's estimated in 2021 in the US that if all the cars that had entered the road system as conventional cars instead of SUVs, there would have been 1,100 fewer pedestrian deaths as a result of just replacing SUVs with normal cars.
Yeah, wow, that's huge. Thank you. And I'm going to preempt, I think, Mrs. Mitchell's questions around the differences in regional areas, because I think one of the arguments that's been made to me is that there's that the health impacts of a petrol car in a regional area is less than in a sort of a more built-up urban area. Is there an argument for saying that, sort of petrol cars in regional areas perhaps shouldn't be given, I guess, the same level of external costs attributed from air pollution as would be the case in an urban area?
Do you want me to tackle that one, Felicity? Yeah, maybe if I don't cover everything you fill in at the end. I mean, we're very, as we mentioned at the outset, we're kind of very mindful of equity issues, across geography and across socioeconomic and cultural differences. So we very much favour the transition from ICE to electric being something that is equitable across regions in Australia. And I guess with less kind of density of petrol of ICE vehicles in very remote areas, there might be less direct impact to local residents from tailpipe emissions, but obviously there's still the impact in terms of climate change. And after all, we're trying to get to 50% reductions from 2005 and 2030, which is not very far away. And I guess to paraphrase, to just take one slight sidestep away from pure health issues, if we want to encourage something, we support it financially. If we want to discourage something, we apply some form of disincentive. And I guess we would be thinking in terms of helping people in regional Australia, in New South Wales, putting in place, great incentives towards electric vehicles rather than supporting existing ICE vehicles would make a lot more sense in terms of the big picture of what we're trying to achieve here. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. When we're looking at sort of I guess we're sort of trying to imagine a more progressive and fair version of this charge, but it's perhaps a little theoretical. I think it's a question as to whether ideally we would be looking at this for all cars, and we'd be doing it at a federal level, rather than sort of trying to squish this into this state-based charge. Would you support it at a federal level that also included petrol cars in a sort of more differentiated way?
I think it's important to say, as a preamble to this response, is that we are not absolute. We're supporting a modified road user charge because we're trying to be engaged constructively with the current process, but we're not absolutely wedded to it as the only approach to achieving the outcomes that we're interested in, and we're really outcomes focused. So we're really, I think, as Dr. Hill mentioned at the outset, we're really focused on doing a good job in terms of the health impacts of direct emissions from tailpipes and from the road for that matter, and also contributing to a better outcome in terms of climate change and better kind of broader equity issues. We don't really care deep in our hearts how that's done, but and we see the potential for the road user charge to provide good outcomes, but we're not absolutely wedded to it. But yes, I guess to return to your specific question, this is well, it's a global issue, but it's also a federal issue. And yes, a solution that encompasses all the states and territories makes a lot more sense than going it alone, if that's feasible, if that's possible. We're also obviously in our submission and in our general approach trying to be practical and not just totally idealistic, and hence our engagement.
I'll just check this. Yep, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the two doctors appearing at this inquiry. Just going to your submission, the federal government would claim over the last 30 years they've made substantial improvements in the volume of tailpipe emissions and their health risks. As it stands in Australia today, what percentage of our carbon emissions come from the tailpipes?
I think, I'm not absolutely certain, but I think it is in the order of 25%, but I'm not 100% certain about that.
Right.
That would have been about my estimate too, but I don't have the figures at my fingertips either.
Right, and you cited the Melbourne University Climate Futures research about 11,000 earlier than expected deaths, where they extrapolated that from New Zealand, which mightn't be the best methodology. But has that been overtaken by this University of Tasmania Centre for Safe Air estimate of 1,800 earlier than expected deaths produced in August of last year? The number's obviously way too high, but 1,800 is a lot better than 11,000.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily been overtaken, but yes, you could. There are a range of estimates out there. The one that I cited was based on New Zealand extrapolated from a New Zealand study, because they have better air pollution monitoring, and it was thought that it was a roughly comparable jurisdiction. If anything, it probably would have lower air pollution rather than higher air pollution. So extrapolation is considered to be reasonable. There are a range of methodologies to approach this.
Right. Okay.
And there is other data from the UK. The College of Paediatrics and Child Health has produced estimates of economic impact from outdoor air pollution. Their estimate is 2.9 trillion globally, and accounting for 2.6% of the UK's annual GDP from air pollution. And they estimate that the costs of air pollution will account for 1% of global GDP by 2060.
Thank you.
This is going to be a very big cost globally.
Thank you. Just check if you've got questions.
The only one is a follow-up to that, like in terms of this accounting that you outlined, are any jurisdictions accounting this negative externality into their accounts, into their national product accounts? Or are we still sort of making these calculations outside the official budget figures? Because it seems to me until you start costing these things in, they become a problem that is escapable, I guess, from a Treasury point of view, to be frank.
Well, yes, that is a problem, because unless you connect health costs into other costs, and if you keep them separate, then you don't consider them as a totality. So if health costs are considered as a sort of siloed cost, separate to productivity costs, or separate to transport costs, or separate to other costs that you might have in your budget, then you don't account for them. But if you think in, we think of health in all policies, health and transport, health and everything else is all relevant.
So are you aware of any jurisdictions that are dealing with that in that integrated way?
Well, I guess the UK, in a kind of way, is starting to do this. They have had a congestion charge in London, and that has raised a significant amount of revenue. They call that the ultra low emissions zone, and they use that revenue in a targeted way to fund other emissions reductions activities. So they've used the revenue to fund, expansion of public transport into areas that are poorly served. So the whole zone then becomes a revenue-raising mechanism for other activities.
Okay.
It's really interesting because I think, we talk a lot about the idea of the road user charge and the fuel excise going into road maintenance, because it's a very obvious thing. You see the roads, the impact on the roads, and then you have a cost of repairing them. It all seems very straightforward. Whereas the cost of, the health impact of car use seems to be dealt with in a completely different way, because it's, I guess, harder for people to visibly see. But we, in effect, have the same thing, that you have a health impact and then you have a government expense on that, on repairing or dealing with that health impact. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure that I can provide a succinct and clear answer to the very good question. But I don't think there's any doubt that there are other jurisdictions which are taking these costs into account, but whether there's anywhere that actually includes it in the budget bottom line, I'm not sure. The UK would be an example. Most European countries would be other examples.
It seems to me as though that is where you get the big step change, because then it actually becomes a tangible cost to the budget. But until it does, you rely on the goodwill of governments to recognise the negative effects on health and, factor it in like they've done in the UK. But I guess it's something we should think about going forward.
Mr. Farlow, did you have a question? He's got his hand up.
He has.
But maybe he's just playing around with the features. Just give him a second. I think he's maybe doesn't have a question. Does anyone else have a question before we wind up? No, that's been.
Sorry, Abigail. I'm trying to.
Right.
Sorry, I'm trying to deal with it while I've got it to my ear. So that's the challenge. I'm just interested in terms of the evidence that was provided regarding the weight issue in particular, and I take it in terms of the emissions concern and the like. Do you think that it would? Is there any way to be able to capture it better in terms of emission saving by weight of vehicle or the like, in terms of some sort of algorithm to be placed in terms of EVs and capturing them for a road user charge, from your perspective?
I think the answer is that it's probably the technical aspects of kind of computing, entering all of these factors into an algorithm is probably beyond our core expertise, and we'd be just, I guess, speculating fairly widely. But I guess I can't see why, if you recognise, a handful of factors that are critical to the problem at hand, that couldn't be incorporated into some algorithm. I think it'd be terribly easy in this day and age, unfortunately.
And I guess my next question then as well is, in terms of the weight issues, I note that you were talking about previously the challenges in people being hit by cars and the like. I imagine that there's no great change when it comes to the weight of electric vehicles in that regard as well.
So in regard to the pedestrian death information we were giving you before, that's specifically related to the bonnet height. I'm sure if you connected it to weight, you would logically find that a more heavy vehicle is more lethal because it will hit you harder. But in terms of bonnet height and the increased pedestrian deaths, the information and evidence we were providing related to bonnet height because of the way in which a pedestrian will be hit is just more lethal because it hits on their chest rather than their legs. So we were specifically highlighting bonnet height as the variable for that. So if you were trying to think about how you're going to design it, the taller the bonnet, potentially the more concerning in terms of pedestrian deaths. So if you were thinking of it in terms of categories, then, you know, a light car, pedestrian vehicle versus an SUV versus a very tall ute with a big bull bar on the front are different categories of safer versus less safe vehicles for that particular issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think that's the final question for you today. So thank you very much for appearing. To the extent there were questions taken on notice or there are any supplementary questions coming from members, the committee secretariat will be in touch. But that concludes our time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
And thank you to Mr. Reid for making yourself available slightly earlier. Can I just check that you can hear me?
I can hear you fine, if you can hear me.
I can indeed. Fabulous. Okay. Let's kick off then. If I could please ask you, Mr. Reid, to state your name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
My name is Tennant Reid. I'm Director of Climate Change and Energy at Australian Industry Group. And I will just bring up the text of the affirmation. There we go. There we go. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And would you like to make a short opening statement?
Certainly. Briefly put, Australian Industry Group has a national position in support of a well-designed and low transaction cost road user charging system with reasonable transition times. We think that, taken on its own, the New South Wales law is not bad. There are some elements of it that could do with a second look in light of the emerging evidence. For example, in relation to the relative performance of pure battery electric versus plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, but the system outlined and empowered in that legislation is not bad. We do have a preference for a universal road user charging system that would relate to mass as well as distance and apply to vehicles of all sorts with appropriate transition arrangements. But we have been supportive of the national conversation about a narrower road user charging system. We do have a very strong preference to see a nationally consistent arrangement, and there are efforts underway led by the Commonwealth Treasury to develop such a system. we would encourage New South Wales to exercise its discretion to defer at least a little further in practice, the practical commencement of the charging system outlined in the existing legislation to give time for that national system to be finalised. Of course, there have been national reform processes that have taken many years to reach a conclusion, or sometimes haven't reached one yet. And no doubt New South Wales would not like to give unlimited time for that national process to conclude. But it does seem at this stage like there's a very real potential for a national system to be concluded, and it would be worth giving some extra time for that to be done, so that we could have the simplest transition to a new form of road use taxation for drivers of all sorts. Ultimately, the economics of electric vehicles, certainly in the light vehicle space, look as if they are very strong and increasingly strong, and a reasonable road user charge does not seem likely to substantially damage those economics. But it's the ease of use, the simplicity of the experience for drivers that is probably going to be more important than the presence or absence of a reasonably defined charge for use of the roads. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with a few questions and then I'll throw it open to my colleagues. Just on that last point that you made, I think that intuitively sounds correct to me in terms of people not necessarily balking at what will hopefully stay at a small per kilometre cost. But if it ends up being an incredibly cumbersome process, there was talk when we were looking at this a few years back of, stat decks to declare where you were driving when and all sorts of things that would be quite sort of problematic. Do you have any anything to back up what to me is intuitively correct? To back up that statement, any sort of evidence,
we have
no
independent research on this point. We do know that during the brief period when the Victorian road use charge for electric vehicle drivers was in effect, and photos of odometers were being emailed to the Victorian government twice a year. That was anecdotally seen as a very cumbersome and tedious process. Occasion, like we were aware of complaints of that. We haven't done our own survey work on that. I would say that the terms of the legislation do appear to provide plenty of scope for implementation of this in a low touch, low mental load way. Yes, there is provision for the individual submission of data, such as odometer readings, to the government, but there's also scope for more automatic provision or for prepayment. And so obviously a lot would depend on actual implementation. There is no track record of that yet, but absent this coordination and similarity between different jurisdictions issue, we would say there appears to be good scope here for the government to do it in a way that makes life easy for drivers, and certainly they should, if it is to be not an inadvertent disincentive.
Thank you. You mentioned that obviously a national arrangement is preferred. Do you see any dangers with New South Wales going it alone in terms of what that would mean for the national agreement process? Would it derail it? Would it hurry it up? What do you think?
So the national process has been undertaken in part due to the prompting of the states, including New South Wales, but also Victoria, has been enthusiastic about moving ahead with some form of road user charge. And so I think it's been not unhelpful for the commencement of that process for this state law to exist and the prospect of state action. If it were to actually be implemented, it's not our view that that would foreclose the national reform from going ahead. And especially that there has been repeated expression of willingness from the state government to fold into a suitable national scheme. Our concern is just the degree of duplication of effort and consumer confusion that might result from a sudden introduction of one system followed by its sudden removal in favour of another. It would really be good to avoid that for a smoother overall uptake both of new road charging arrangements and EVs themselves.
In last week's budget, in the New South Wales budget, there was $440 million forecast to be collected from the road user charge between 2027-28 and the 29-30 financial year. Obviously, sort of ratcheting up as it gets towards that 2030 mark, and then I assume that we would see sort of a higher uptake of EVs, and then the road user charge would be sort of bringing in even more. There's quite a lot of money for New South Wales, I guess, to forego, and I can understand why they might want to be pushing ahead with this. Do you think at a federal level that they would be looking at passing through the same sorts of dollars as that? Do you think that it's too uncertain as to how much money would come through to the states?
It is quite uncertain at the moment, and the scope, the timing, and the level of a national system or a nationally coordinated, consistent system is, as far as we're aware, all up in the air. As are whatever arrangements might be made, either for the sharing of that revenue or for compensatory changes to be made in other areas of national or state taxing spending. There is often a delicate dance in federal state relations around taxing and spending, and it is easy for a boost in one area to be negatived by a change in another. So in the end, there is a long-term issue with the erosion of the fuel tax base, which is a moderate but important component of the total national tax take, and that will need to be addressed one way or another. And that is perfectly appropriate. In the short term, there may well be some argy-bargy between jurisdictions, but $440 million, although a lot to you and me, is a modest sum in the total federal state financial pie.
Do you think there's a higher risk of a state road user charge ratcheting up in terms of the numbers of cents per kilometre than if it was at a federal level? Do you think is there any sort of anecdotal evidence of other types of charges? Again, it's one of those things that intuitively feels like more of a possibility, but yeah, I'm not sure. Do you have a view?
Well, my best guess, and it can only be a guess, is that there will be, as more and more drivers are subject to a charge of this sort, at whatever level of government it's collected, they will prove every bit as sensitive as internal combustion engine drivers are to changes in the tax base and rate. At times there may be a case that people will concede for raising that rate, but probably we would see quite loud voices complaining about an increase. If that rate of increase was solely the matter for the state government and the parliament to determine, that might make it easier, if anything, to focus those complaints than if the entire of the National Cabinet, for example, were collectively responsible. But I think either way, it's a matter for the politics of the day. But taxes don't tend to pass without comment, especially when you feel them quite regularly as a driver.
That's an excellent answer to what was quite a nebulous question. I'll go to the Honourable Mark Latham.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Tenant Reid. In terms of the Vanderstock ruling of the High Court, isn't it feasible for the federal government to collect the road user charge on EVs and then distribute that money to the states? To be a system similar to the GST, albeit on a smaller scale. And under Section 51(2) of the Constitution, the levy would need to be uniform across the Commonwealth. So, and in that respect, is the Australian Industry Group aware of any discussions between treasurers, federal and state, along those lines?
So, there's several issues involved in all that. With respect to the Vanderstock decision, this is one of those, it's a long time since I was in law school, but this is one of those where, unfortunately, the High Court hasn't spoken with a completely uniform voice. It appears to me as if the majority of the majority view in Vanderstock would foreclose state-level taxes of this sort, but we won't find out until and unless this comes into effect and somebody takes them out to court. Otherwise, assuming that this law is permissible, a national level tax or excise, or however constructed, that raised this kind of revenue instead would certainly be very viable in a practical sense, and as far as we can judge, a legal sense. And then distributing those revenues to the states would make there'd be a strong argument for that. There would be a question, I think, of whether the better approach was to distribute the revenues to the states, or as with fuel excise, to spend from consolidated revenue on a range of issues, including road maintenance, or perhaps road maintenance and public charging infrastructure, matters that the states also have an interest in. On the uniformness, certainly distinguishing, again, as far as we're aware, distinguishing between the states in setting the rate would not be permissible. It might be permissible to distinguish on other grounds, which would have a differential impact between the states. There has been a lot of interest over the years, although also caution, in more sophisticated forms of road user charging that would take account of, among other things, congestion in a live way or in a less dynamic way. And the level of congestion varies both within and between the states. So we wouldn't want to foreclose that kind of capability, but it does seem in the medium term as if a much simpler form of road user charging is the most that any level of government is likely to consider.
Thank you.
Can I ask Mr. Budgig, did you have any questions? Any questions from you, Sarah?
No, I think I'm okay, Chair. Thank you.
Very good. I'll just ask one more. In relation to the universal model that you were discussing, where mass as well as distance was included, that's something that's come up a few times from other people as well. I guess, do you have any specifics as to how that might work in terms of the extra impact of mass on the percentage increase in the amount of cents per kilometre, or how are you imagining that would work?
So you would want a formula. It would make the system a little harder to describe in an abstract way versus a simple cents per kilometre basis. But you would want a formula that enabled a smooth change in the cost for vehicles of escalating mass, in part to avoid the need for some of the distinctions that are made in the existing charge. So to go back to an issue I briefly adverted to earlier, there's a differential rate in the current state law between pure battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. A 20% reduction in the per kilometre charge for plug-in hybrid vehicles, reflecting an implicit view that PHEVs are, while still consuming some fuel, are much, much more fuel efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles, and so should only, on the view behind the legislation, pay a modestly reduced portion of the road user charge. Now, there is some evidence from studies conducted in Europe using a very large volume of over-the-air reported data from real-world driving of connected vehicles, that in practice, the efficiency gains of the existing fleet of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in Europe are not nearly as great as has been estimated through existing regulatory test cycles. Mm-hmm. And that is, as the publishers of those studies find, is due to a mixture of the vehicles not being plugged in as often as is assumed in regulatory test cycles, and the combustion engines operating more often than assumed, even when the vehicles are in battery discharge mode. And the result of that data is that the real world indication of those existing plug-in hybrid vehicles is they're about as fuel efficient as conventional hybrids. That is about a 20% improvement over traditional ICE vehicles. If that is correct in the Australian context, and we have a different mix of models than in Europe, and if it were to remain true over time, and we have the prospect of a quite different style of plug-in hybrid, sometimes called a range extended EV, where there's quite a small ICE engine that is solely doing the job of recharging the battery, with larger batteries than in most current plug-in hybrids. So if we don't consider those sorts of differences and changes, then currently, by having just a simple pair of classes of vehicle in the tax arrangement, it might be that this New South Wales system would overtax plug-in hybrids relative to the intention that those drivers would be paying both fuel excise on a larger fuel consumption than might be assumed, and a distance-based charge that is only slightly downrated. Those sorts of distortions could be avoided with a system that was universal and which varied, so you weren't making just a flat distinction between one class of vehicle and another, and which took account of the mass and the distance and left the fuel efficiency or otherwise of the vehicle to be reflected in the actual fuel bills of the driver, rather than trying to anticipate in legislation what that difference would be. That kind of idea would also be compatible with ideas which we've also suggested for a residual carbon charge on fuel combustion, which mechanically would be just retaining fuel excise but lowering it to a level consistent with the national carbon pricing safeguard mechanism. It may be more detail than you wanted.
No, it's fantastic. Thank you. That's really useful. Excellent. I'll just check if any of my colleagues have more questions. No. Thank you very much for your time today. To the extent there were questions taken on notice, I don't think there were, but there may be some supplementary questions coming. The committee secretariat will be in touch. But that concludes our time with you. Thank you very much. It also concludes our hearing for today. The committee has resolved to hold a further hearing to hear from some government witnesses, but we will put on the website when we're ready when that will be. But that concludes us for today. Thank you.